All right, so get this. We're diving into some seriously thought-provoking stuff today. You sent us this excerpt. There is no pure empirical reasoning. And wow, it really makes you think, like, how do we really know anything for sure? Especially in science, which we usually see as, the gold standard for facts.
It's really interesting, right? This paper digs into empiricism, that whole idea that all our knowledge comes from experiences. But the author, he's arguing it's not as simple as it seems, not even in science.
Yeah, he's basically saying even when scientists are drawing conclusions, they're relying on more than just what they observe, right? Like there's this hidden layer of what he calls background probabilistic information. What is that exactly?
Well, think of it like this. It's like having a hunch about something before you even start looking for evidence. Those gut feelings, those initial assumptions, they actually play a bigger role than we might realize.
So it's not enough to just see something we also come to the table with, like preconceived notions about how the world works.
Exactly. And the author breaks this down into two main types of background information. First, there's how likely we already thought the conclusion was even before we had any evidence. Then there's how the evidence we're seeing actually affects how much we believe that conclusion.
Okay, I think I'm following. But
Yeah.
can you give us an example? Make it a little more concrete.
Sure. Imagine someone who's never seen a swan before. The very first time they see one, they're not going to think, oh, another white swan. They're going to be surprised, maybe even a little confused.
They have zero experience with swans, right?
Oh.
No pre-existing category for them.
Right. But then imagine they see 100 white swans in a row. Their thinking starts to shift, right? They begin to think, maybe all swans are white. But, and here's the kicker, even that conclusion is based on a deeper assumption. Like, how do we know swans don't change color seasonally? What if they've just stumbled upon them during, like, white swan season?
Okay, now that's where it gets interesting. Because that kind of assumption that color is this stable, unchanging property isn't something we directly observe. It's more like this underlying belief we have about the world.
And that's exactly his point. These underlying assumptions, these prior probabilities, they shape how we interpret everything. He uses some really thought-provoking examples to illustrate this. Remember that whole brain in a vat idea from, like, Philosophy 101?
Oh yeah, the idea that we could all be brains in jars, just experiencing some kind of simulated reality, definitely a mind-bending thought experiment.
Exactly. Empirically speaking, there's not a huge difference between that and the idea that we're experiencing actual reality, but most people, they find the brain in a vat thing pretty far-fetched. Why is that?
It just feels less likely,
Yeah.
even though we can't definitively prove it's not true.
And that's because, instinctively, we assign a really low probability to that scenario. It just doesn't fit with our understanding of how things work.
So we've got these probabilities influencing everything, but then the paper brings up this grue and green shamrock problem. It sounds kind of ridiculous, but it makes a really important point. Can you refresh our memory on that one?
Absolutely. So imagine you've only ever seen green shamrocks. You'd probably conclude that all shamrocks are green, right? But now let's introduce a new color. Grue.
Ooh, grue. Okay, now you've got my attention.
Grue is defined as green before a certain time, let's say, tomorrow at midnight, and blue after that. All those shamrocks you've seen, they're both green and grue since it's still before midnight.
So wait, are we supposed to believe that shamrocks are grue? Sounds like some kind of philosophical loophole.
Right. But here's where our intuition about probabilities comes in. The probability of shamrocks staying grue, meaning they'd suddenly turn blue overnight, just feels way lower than the probability of them just staying green. Why is that?
Because we have this pre-existing belief about color being consistent, right? We instinctively think green is a more fundamental category than grue, even if we can't explain why.
Exactly. And the paper argues that this kind of background information, it's not something we learn just by observing shamrocks. It feels more like a fundamental assumption about the universe.
So then where do these deeply held probabilities come from? Are we just stuck with them?
Well, the author explores a few potential answers. One idea is to find a completely objective rule for figuring out these probabilities. Something like the straight rule.
This great rule.
Yeah, it basically says you base your probabilities only on what you've observed directly.
So if I've seen 100 birds and 75 were sparrows, there's a 75% chance the next bird I see will be a sparrow. Seems straightforward enough.
It seems straightforward, right? But it actually runs into problems pretty quickly. The paper points out that using the straight rule, it can actually lead to contradictions. Like, it really depends on how you define your observations in the first place.
Okay, so maybe not so straightforward after all?
Right. And even if we did find a rule that seemed totally objective, we'd still need a reason to pick that specific rule over all the others. And that reason itself, it wouldn't be based on just pure observation, would it?
Okay, I'm starting to see the issue here. We can't seem to escape these underlying assumptions no matter what we do.
Exactly. And that leads us to something called subjective Bayesianism.
All right, hit me with it. What is subjective Bayesianism?
So it basically suggests that any internally consistent set of those prior probabilities, it's fair game. Essentially, your initial beliefs, they're just that. They're yours.
So if I want to say there's like a 75% chance the Earth is secretly ruled by a colony of highly intelligent ants,
Yeah.
that's fine. No one can tell me I'm wrong.
Well, as long as those beliefs don't contradict each other, like you can't also believe there's a 50% chance the Earth is flat, right? Your
Yeah.
beliefs have to at least be consistent within your own little framework.
Interesting. Okay. But if everyone's running around with their own subjective probabilities, how do we ever actually agree on anything? Won't that just lead to total chaos?
It's a common concern, and it's where subjective Bayesians often point to these things called convergence theorems.
Convergence theorems. Okay, you're going to have to break that down for me. What are those?
So basically, they suggest that even if we all start with totally different beliefs, if we're given enough evidence, our beliefs will kind of naturally converge towards the truth. It's like two ships sailing from opposite sides of the world, but they're both heading for the same port.
So even if we have different starting points, more information will eventually lead us to the same conclusions.
Yeah, that's the general idea. The more data we gather, the less important those initial assumptions become.
Okay, so problem solved. We all just need to keep gathering more evidence, and we'll all end up on the same page.
Not quite. The paper points out that while this convergence, it's kind of reassuring, it doesn't actually address the underlying problem of subjectivity.
Ugh, I knew there had to be a catch. What's the catch this time?
The catch is that at any point in time, we're always working with a limited amount of evidence, right? And there's this thing the author calls the divergence principle. And it basically highlights how you can take the same exact evidence and reach wildly different conclusions, all depending on your prior probabilities.
Can you give me a real-world example of that? I need something I can actually wrap my head around.
Okay, let's go back to those shamrocks. Let's say you and I, we both observe 1,000 shamrocks, and every single one is green. Now, someone with a really strong prior belief in, say, leprechauns and their magical powers, they might look at that evidence and conclude that the leprechauns are just really good at hiding all the other colored shamrocks.
While someone else, maybe a botanist, would just conclude that, based on the evidence, shamrocks are most likely just green.
Exactly. And here's the thing. Both of those conclusions, they actually fit with the evidence. Neither person is necessarily being irrational. They're both operating within their own internal model of how they see the world.
So even with all that evidence, their fundamental beliefs, whether it's about leprechauns or botany, might not really budge.
Exactly. And it goes even deeper than that. The paper actually highlights that even when people agree that a piece of evidence supports a certain conclusion, they might still disagree on how much support that evidence actually gives.
So two scientists could look at the same data, both agree that it points towards a specific theory, but still be miles apart on how confident they feel in that theory.
Exactly. It all circles back to those pesky prior probabilities. And what's really fascinating is that the paper argues that this even applies to what we think of as, very straightforward scientific evidence. Even stuff like those experiments that show that water is made of hydrogen and oxygen, those interpretations are still being shaped by our prior assumptions about how the world works.
So we're basically back to square one. No matter what we do, we can't escape this subjective lens.
Well, there's another avenue that the paper explores, externalism.
Okay, I'm listening. What is externalism?
So externalism, it takes a different approach. Instead of focusing on what's going on inside our heads, it says what actually justifies our beliefs is how well they match up with the external world.
So it doesn't matter if my belief that I can fly is, internally consistent. If I jump out a window, reality is going to set me straight pretty quickly.
That's one way to put it. But yeah, one way externalists try to ground beliefs is through this idea of reliability. Basically, a belief-forming process. It's reliable if it usually tends to produce true beliefs.
So, for example, the belief that the sun will rise every morning is a reliable one because, well, it's been doing that for as long as humans have been around.
Exactly. We can look back at history and see that this belief, it's generally led to accurate predictions. But here's where things get really interesting. Even this approach, which seems to, tie our beliefs to something outside of ourselves, it still bumps up against that issue of prior probabilities.
Okay, I'm sensing another plot twist coming. What's the issue this time?
The issue is that for externalism to really work, we have to believe that our prior probabilities, those very basic beliefs about the world, they're themselves justified because they're reliable. Because, historically speaking, they've generally led to true conclusions.
So my belief that the sun will rise tomorrow is justified because, well, for all of human history, it pretty much always has.
In a nutshell, yeah. But the problem is that justification isn't really based on direct observation, is it? It's more like saying, well, these beliefs have been useful for survival, so they must be justified.
Which is starting to sound a lot like,
Rationalism.
and suddenly we're back to where we started. Or are we? And we're back. It's like we've been on this philosophical journey, empiricism, subjective Bayesianism, even a little detour through externalism.
And where do we end up?
Face-to-face with God rationalism.
It's true. It's like in those movies, where the quiet character you barely even notice turns out to be the mastermind behind everything.
Right. So we've seen how purely observation-based knowledge, it hits some snags. But what if, instead of just experiences, we have some kind of inbuilt knowledge, or at least some starting beliefs we're predisposed to? That's rationalism.
That's a great way to put it. Instead of a blank slate, we've got some preloaded software, some basic assumptions that shape how we see everything. And the key here is, these aren't just random. Rationalism says they're rooted in the very structure of reason itself.
Okay, I'm with you so far. But if our minds were truly blank slates, how could we even make sense of anything? All the sights, sounds, everything hitting us constantly.
Exactly. If we had to start from scratch every morning, who knows if we'd ever make it out of bed?
Yeah.
But you're right to point out there are some big questions about rationalism. Like, how do we know which of these, inbuilt beliefs are the right ones? And what about the fact that people clearly have different starting points for what they believe about the world?
Right, right.
Yeah, and the paper acknowledges that. Figuring out the specifics of those innate probabilities, it's a massive challenge. But here's the thing, even without all the answers, the rationalist view, it just makes more sense. It explains how we actually reason in a way that just relying on experience can't quite do.
So it's like, we found a treasure map, right, but it's missing some key details.
Yeah.
Still more useful than wandering around in the dark.
Exactly. It gives us a framework for understanding why we tend to think in certain ways. Remember that whole GRU problem? Our gut feeling that green is more stable than GRU, it makes more sense if we accept we have some inbuilt assumptions about the world.
It's like those aha moments.
Yeah.
It's less that we're discovering something totally new and more like we're connecting with something that was already there, just hidden.
Precisely. And that brings us back to you, dear listener, because this isn't just about abstract philosophical ideas. It's about how this stuff plays out in your everyday life.
If even scientific knowledge is shaped by these prior probabilities, it makes you wonder, right? What are your prior probabilities? What assumptions are you bringing to the table when you're looking at evidence? Whether it's a research paper, a news article, even just talking with a friend.
It's about recognizing that we all have these internal biases, right? These lenses we see the world through. But by acknowledging them, by being open to the fact that our perspective isn't the only one, that's where the good stuff happens. That's how we grow and learn.
It's humbling, yeah, but also kind of freeing. We don't have to be afraid of questioning what we think we know, of being open to new information, even if it challenges our existing beliefs.
And that's what makes this whole journey of knowledge and understanding so exciting. It's not about some final answer. It's about the journey itself, the questioning, the exploring, the constant refining of our understanding of, well, everything.
Well said. This has been quite the deep dive. I don't know about you, but I'm walking away with more questions than answers.
Yeah.
And honestly, that's a good feeling.
I agree. It means we're one step closer to finding that hidden treasure. So until next time, keep asking those tough questions and keep on digging.
Absolutely. And we'll see you next time for another deep dive.